Imagine going to sleep for 20 years and waking up expecting South Africa to look like one of the world's fastest growing economies.
But just 5 kilometres away, here in Alexandra, Johannesburg's oldest township, the country's festering problems of unemployment, inequality and poverty are all too conspicuous.
After all, we had the minerals, the banks, the infrastructure, the biggest economy on the continent. We had everything countries dream of having. Instead, something almost impossible happened. The average South African today is poorer than the average South African was nearly 20 years ago. Think about that for a second. Not poor because of one bad year, not because of one recession, not because of one financial crisis. Poor after 2 entire decades. While China became an economic superpower, while India built one of the fastest growing economies on earth, and while countries with far fewer resources started catching up, South Africa did something much more dangerous. It stood still. And in economics, standing still is the same as falling behind. So I started asking myself a simple question. How does a country with so much potential become poorer over 20 years without ever actually collapsing? After digging through economic reports, GDP data, government documents, and decades of South African economic history, I realized something. There wasn't a catastrophe. There wasn't one policy. There were 5 slow leaks, 5 problems that quietly drained the economy year after year. None of them dramatic enough to make global headlines, but together powerful enough to hold back an entire nation. And the 5th one, almost nobody is talking about, yet it might be the single biggest threat to South Africa's future. Here's a system most people never think about until it fails, and suddenly nothing can get anywhere. South Africa's rail network has been described in the government's own draft master plan as a product of decades of stunt development, layered with operational complexity that makes it struggle to complete even basic road transport. That's not an outside critic talking. That's the Transport Department's own assessment of its own network. The cost of that dysfunction is enormous and specific. Officials estimate that shifting just 60 million tons of freight from road back into proper functioning rail system would save South African businesses over 26 billion rands a year in logistics costs alone. That's money currently being lost every single year to a rail and port system that can't do the basic job it exists to do. Mining companies in a country built on mining have to stockpile export commodities because the trains that should be carrying them to the ports simply aren't running reliably. Ships queue outside Durban and Cape Town for days. Every day of delay is a cost passed on to a business, then to a customer, then to a country's competitiveness on the global market that doesn't wait for anyone to catch up. There is now a 2 trillion rand plan to fix it, but fixing a rail network takes engineers, planners, and skilled technical staff, and that's exactly the resource South Africa has been losing the fastest. This is the league most people underestimate because it doesn't show up in a single dramatic headline. It shows up quietly, one departure at a time, over years. South Africa has one of the most severe skilled worker migration rates in the world. The reasons cited over and over by people who leave are remarkably consistent. Crime, a heavy regulatory environment, deteriorating infrastructure, high port costs, expensive and unreliable electricity. Literally the same list of problems the last 2 chapters talked about. The health sector shows the scale most starkly. More than 23,000 South African trained health professionals are now working in the UK, US, Australia and New Zealand alone. Every doctor who leaves represents years of subsidized training that another country now benefits from for free, while South African hospitals operate short-staffed. And it isn't only healthcare, engineers, accountants, and skilled tradespeople, precisely the workforce needed to fix Eskom, rebuild the rail network, and run new investment projects, are living in numbers significant enough that industry bodies abroad have documented rising volumes of South African professionals applying to work overseas. Here's what makes this league different from others. You can't patch it with a single infrastructure project or a policy reform announced in a budget speech, but you can slow it by making the underlying reason people live less true. And that means fixing everything else on this list first, which is exactly the trap South Africa has been stuck on for years. But even skilled people who stay are operating outside a labor market with a structural problem baked into its foundations. More than 3 decades after apartheid officially ended, its economic geography has remained physically distant from where the jobs actually are, meaning transport cost alone can price someone out of a job because before they've even applied for it. That's geographic exclusion. That geographic exclusion compounds everything else. It keeps labor force participation abnormally low, meaning employment policy can't work as intended because a meaningful share of the working age population is structurally cut off from where the opportunity exists in the first place. Layer onto that an economy that historically grew through capital intensive sectors, mining, banking, finance, rather than labor intensive manufacturing, that gave countries like South Korea and China a fast path to mass employment, and you get an economy that can technically grow while unemployment stays brutally high, which is exactly what happens for most of the post-apartheid era. This isn't a problem with a quick fix, it's a geographic history baked into the shape of the economy itself. I promised you the most important part is last. Here it is. In 2024, something happened that hasn't happened since 1994. The ANC lost its outright majority. South Africa got its first national coalition government, the Government of National Unity, bringing together parties that have spent decades as rivals. That matters more than it sounds. A coalition government means more oversight, more competing interests forced to check each other, and cautiously more pressure for the kind of reform a single dominant party never had to deliver. And there are real signs it's working slowly. In June 2026, Fitch upgraded South Africa's credit rating for the first time since 2020 downgrade, citing improved fiscal management and better debt trajectory than expected. Inflation has eased, the rand has strengthened. Over R1 trillion in infrastructure spending is now penciled into the national budget for the next 3 years, aimed at the rail, ports, energy bottlenecks covered in this video. And this is the part that matters the most. Every one of these signals is fragile. Growth is still forecast under 2% for 2026. Capital investment sits at 13.7% of GDP against the target of 30%. The coalition is holding. This reform push together is new, untested over a full electoral cycle. South Africa isn't collapsing, but it isn't recovering yet either. It's balanced precisely between the version of this story where the last 2 years become the turning point. Thank you for watching this video. Again, I want to say thank you for 50 subscribers. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.